Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me? All right. It's hard to be the last set of panels, right? Because people are, they're ready to go to social. What we have, is there a networking? See, we're between cocktail hour, so we better get started here so we can get you guys set up. I'm Michael Johnson from JPMorgan Chase, Global Philanthropy. Quickly, a big plug, of course. JPMorgan Chase Foundation is part of a larger effort around our corporate responsibility work within our footprint globally. Just last year, in 2018, we provided about $275 million in grants to nonprofits and organizations throughout our markets globally, and about 10 million of that actually focused on what we call our current flexible capital lending. The hope and the intended purpose of our work going forward is that we intend to commit about $1.75 billion over the next 5 years, tied to work that we're doing in our what we call our pro neighborhoods, our partnership for raising opportunities, our new skills initiative around workforce alternatives and looking at demand-driven work initiatives, our small business expansion, which ties to work around entrepreneurs and entrepreneurs of color. And then our more recent work around what we call advancing cities, which is our effort to think about cross-pillar, cross-related issues involving cities and the troubles that they're facing. But with that, I think this conversation today, we've been talking a lot about construction of supportive housing. I think what is quite important today, at least in this conversation, is how do we deal with the preservation of existing supportive housing. And this is a conversation that's not just about the actual nonprofits, but the city and those sort of stakeholders that are involved in helping to finance and create policy around it. JPMorgan Chase's perspective from this side is that we are actually happy to be in this space. We're happy to be engaged in this space in terms of how we can really create a community of practice and a dialogue that exists amongst that. With that, a couple of quick sort of framing, and then we'll have some introductions of the panel. The other thing around the ground rules is that today, once we finish this, I'd want to make sure that folks had any burning questions, any main questions they want to have on the front end of this discussion that could be weeded into this conversation, because I think the flow of our conversation is about how do I get started? How do I get to this position where I can be a part of a preservation effort and play in this space, and we have a good panel of experts there. So as you know, supportive housing work really was born in the 1980s, but I think what has happened over time, of course, there's been an aging stock that exists within the city of New York. The network has identified almost 6,500 units of supportive housing that is in need of preservation due to issues of physical repair, rehabilitation needs, some regulatory agreements that continue to be needed but are expiring. And then also when you think about the contractual rates that are really impacting the service and the building operations of these facilities. I had an opportunity to do a tour with the Supportive Housing Network and one particular development across, and if you guys from Brooklyn, Myrtle Avenue, somewhere in that area, which of course has changed tremendously. There's a supportive housing building there that I discovered, didn't know was there. But the actual building owner and the supportive housing organization said to me, every day someone is asking them whether they'd be willing to sell this. And as you can imagine, there's a lot of pressure there. One thing I want to also share before jumping into introducing the panel is that at the end of the day, there's real opportunity to think about the supportive housing work. And we're hoping that while this conversation is a conversation amongst experts in the city who really are trying to channel through some of these concerns, we want to hear from you. We want to hear where your perspectives are on it and really engage in this space so that people come out of this with be able to have contacts, some ideas, and some ways that we can continue to move the needle forward here. So with that being said, I want to have each of the panel introduce themselves, quick description of your organizations, and then we'll jump into a moderated discussion to talk about the process for preservation, the financial needs, and some of the other components of that. So before that, again, burning questions. Any particular question that you think is so essential to be added to this conversation before we begin? I'm opening it up right now. Quiet group. I guess you guys waiting for cocktails, huh? Okay. All right. So with that being said, let's start here.
Great. Good afternoon. Everyone hear me okay? My name is Kerry LaBotz. I'm the Assistant Commissioner for Preservation Finance at HPD. Just to give a quick overview of the unit that I oversee, our goal is to work with owners of existing regulated housing as well as private owners of existing housing that has naturally occurring affordability. We work to ensure that we are able to provide a source of financing through our subsidy loans and through our tax exemptions to both provide a source of long-term viability and ensure operations going forward, but make sure that capital needs are addressed. So we do this through a range of programs. And to give a sense of scale, since the start of Housing New York, which is the Mayor's Housing Plan, which started in 2014, we've closed on approximately 83,000 units of existing housing. So the preservation goals from here on out and the preservation work that we've done so far is significant, which is really fantastic. My role today in this discussion is going to focus on one of our preservation programs in particular, a program that we call the Year 15 program, which focuses on serving projects that are reaching the end of their tax credit compliance period and at the point of their exit, providing a source of additional capital, tax exemptions in exchange for entering into long-term affordability agreements with the city. So our goal through all of our programs is to ensure existing affordability for the long term, but in particular where we're seeing that overlap with supportive housing is in our tax credit portfolio. So thanks so much.
Hi, my name is Sara Tempel. I'm the Director of Policy and Rental Assistance in the Office of Development. So I do homeless policy work, but my main role is I oversee the unit that receives all initial applications for rental assistance that HBD provides before they go to our Division of Tenant Resources. So we do the rent-ups, we do the re-rentals, and we really kind of see the successes and mistakes that are being done during that process. I also work kind of as a liaison between the sponsor and developer and our Division of Tenant Resources to help out any kinks that come along. And then we also manage the COC contracts for those that have COC rental assistance. And then I'm also the person behind the NYC 1515 rental assistance email. So I award the projects for new projects coming to the portfolio. And I'll be talking mainly about concrete things you can do currently with the rental assistance programs you have to increase your operating funding for those.
Hello, my name is Ismene Speliotis, and I'm the Executive Director of MHANY Mutual Housing Association of New York. And MHANY is a not-for-profit community housing organization that actually specializes in preservation. And we've started with renovating vacant buildings, and over the 30 years of our existence have renovated between 600 and 1,200 units in a variety of ways, involving vacant buildings, buildings with actually relocating people temporarily within the building or outside the building, and or renovating the buildings with people in occupancy, which I think is probably most relevant to preservation of existing stock, because one of the big dilemmas is how do you rehab around families when you can't move them all out for a whole variety of reasons that we'll talk about also. So MHANY's new to the supportive housing world, but extremely not new to the preservation world. So hoping to bring some real pragmatic insight to the conversation tonight.
Hi everyone, my name is Niall Murray and I'm the Managing Principal and Founder of Rockabill Consulting and Rockabill Development. Actually, I'll just take that from me. Rockabill has been around since, so we were formed in 2007, and we specialize in the affordable supportive housing industry, and we've worked primarily with not-for-profit organizations to help to build affordable housing and predominantly preserve affordable housing and supportive housing. And in the 12 years, we've done about 10,000 units in a variety of kind of roles, and about 9,000 of the 10,000 are existing housing that we've preserved, most of which are affordable housing. We've done some supportive housing, and we'll talk about specifically one project on the Upper West Side that was a supportive housing project that was very complex undertaking, and we'll speak to that. And we also partner with not-for-profits to help them kind of navigate the seas and the complex avenues that are involved in terms of financing and building and renovating existing affordable housing.
Great. Thank you, guys. So the way we're going to sort of walk through this sort of conversation is really from the very beginning, around the question of how do you approach preservation, and how do you adopt a building? How do you get into that perspective? So I guess a question for the group, what typical obstacles, threats, or challenges are the current building owners facing right now? And if you're sort of considering this idea of taking over a distressed building and sort of getting into this idea of preservation and a preservation project, where do you begin? What mindset as a new owner should you have? So we can start with Kerry, and we'll go through the group.
Sure. So I think, kind of taking a step back and thinking about where an owner, and I can kind of speak more specifically to an owner who's going to approach HPD, is thinking about what are the needs in the building. We always want to start there. What are the needs in the building? How much debt can you leverage? And that helps give guidance to what type of preservation program that you're going to be coming to the city to explore. So if we're thinking about kind of the regulated world, you have a HUD multifamily contract, you're coming in through one door. If you have an existing tax credit portfolio, you're coming in through another door. And then again, if you're just, if you have, you're purchasing a building, there's naturally occurring affordability, or you are, you have a regulated, some regulated housing stock, you need to, do some capital improvements, then that's another program. So what we're always asking owners to do when they approach us is to think about first getting an integrated physical needs assessment. That's going to help you understand and help us understand what your short and long-term capital needs are. And it's also going to give guidance on what energy efficiency measures, which the city is very focused on in terms of providing a source of flexible funding to be able to help buildings become more efficient, in particular to put in solar. And be able to assess those needs through our required, what we call an IPNA, which is the Integrated Physical Needs Assessment, and also thinking about how much debt that you can leverage. So are you coming in and asking for HPD only because you're not able to leverage any debt? And we have programs that can sort of address buildings that meet that typology, but then also thinking about, if we're coming in as subordinate debt. So it's always about what is the role of the city, what are the needs of the building, and approaching the city to kind of think through what is the best financing mechanism for that with us.
Sara, and Ismene?
So I think, so you clearly have to know what you need, and you have to know how much you can afford, how you're going to pay for what you need. I think another piece that's really, really critical is you think about whether you're the owner. So if you're the owner, you know your building, you know your population, you know your residents, so I think that's on some level easier. If you're stepping into either a for-profit supportive housing deal, there's a for-profit owner, private, or somebody wants to get out and maybe they've not been paying as much attention to their residents, et cetera. One thing that we really, that's key in preservation is the people already live there, and they're going to have some concerns. So you can imagine in the privately owned sector, where they their owner never talks to them, and they may have been mistreated. The building has been neglected. Their needs have not been met. They may be financially harassed, especially as Michael said, if the owner's getting calls to sell every day, he may be thinking, let me, get these people out and put some other people in or whatever. So you have to think about how am I going to actually relate to the residents in these buildings to be able to actually do what I'm going to do. Because you can go in, you can do an IPNA, you can go to Kerry and to Sara and find out how you're going to pay for it, and then you can actually hit a brick wall. Where the residents are like, thank you very much, but I'm actually not really interested in you coming into my apartment, coming into my building, touching anything. They're going to be afraid that the rents are going to go up. They're going to be afraid that you're renovating it for somebody else because their experience has been that owners don't take care of them. And so kind of really thinking as an organization whether you have the capacity and interest in actually talking to these folks because they're going to become part of, as MHANY approaches it, they're part of your family. And the more you are kind of ready to do that, the more successful you're going to be, and the more it'll be more fun, it'll be harder, it'll be fun, but you will be more successful at the end of the day.
So I want to hear your point now on the as the advisory side, and then I want to sort of circle back on a couple of themes that I'm hearing. There's the physical need, there's getting the building in place, and then there's who's in the building, right, and the occupants. And so I want to tease that out a little bit more before we jump into the next part, but now.
Yeah, and I mean, part of that is, which we can talk about and touch on later on, is just the process that's involved in putting it, putting a preservation project together. And I think just to amplify what Ismene said, I think part of that decision about, how to undertake and what to undertake in terms of preservation is just your own organization's capacity. So, internal capacity, internal knowledge. Everybody's busy running, doing what they do. And so, undertaking a preservation project is a full commitment. It's a commitment of staff, it's a commitment of resources, it's a commitment of time. And so I think that's, in addition to understanding what it is that you're undertaking, dealing with the residents, it's actually, having an honest and open discussion, with your board, with your staff in terms of your capacity and where there are gaps in your capacity. What makes sense to move forward on a preservation? Is this something that we will undertake ourselves? Is this something that we want to hire a developer for? Is this something that we want to partner with another organization that has experience in this? So that kind of becomes a very important decision, because a lot of organizations can get stuck on, we're going to undertake a preservation, now what? And as we'll talk about in terms of the jigsaw puzzle, I'm going to describe kind of the jigsaw puzzle of putting together a development deal in a little bit. But you can make missteps along the way in that process. And so having an honest and open discussion with your staff and with your board and with your management team as to what your own internal capacities are, I think becomes a key component to the decision in terms of what is the next step.
And so I guess what I'm hearing from the conversation is that while there's a physical need, there needs to be sort of a full assessment. And I think as an organization steps in with good intentions, because the folks that are in the building, of course, need to be kept. This is more than just a preservation of a space. This is preservation of people who live there. Has there been sort of examples, I'll go back to you now, where you have consulted to say at the end of the day, the people that live there, there may be some potential displacement? Or to some extent, how do you advise them to the extent that, is it more about the building? Is it about the building and the people at the end of the day?
I would say we focus less on the operational side and more, that it's that initial step as to, advising the organization. This is what a preservation transaction, this is what's involved in a preservation transaction. Do you have the capacity to take this on? Do you want to assume the risk? So there's financial risk in terms of any financing undertaking that you're doing. And so, that becomes the first part of the, consulting assignment. And then depending on what that answer is, there's a couple of different directions. And MHANY has done a terrific job in terms of hosting panels on joint ventures, primarily focused on new development, but the same types of discussions and decisions are relevant to preservation.
Great. And Ismene, your perspective is sort of, you mentioned this idea of them being part of the family. What do you mean literally by that? Are you intending to make sure at the end of the day that they, whatever means you can keep those folks in the space and preserve it?
Absolutely.
Or any examples you might have?
I mean, absolutely. We are, I and Kerry and Sara can talk to this. I think it's hard to go in and say you're a preservation developer and then displace people. Whether as a nonprofit, that would be against our mission. But I think that I think you really are going in, and we're looking right now at a project. And I think actually something to think about that ties to this is when you're looking at a building. Some of these preservation deals, like Kerry said, were developed they were developed sometime over the last 30 years, okay? And so there was different funding, there were different priorities. The population in the building may have changed, it may have aged. Those folks might have moved out, different people might have moved in, people might have been following the regulatory agreements, they might not have been following the regulatory agreements, and the city today has a different level of crisis in the supportive housing area. And so I think one of the things that, whether it's Kerry, whether it's Teresa, whether it's Sara, they're going to ask you, like, okay, what are you going to do with the vacancies? And so you're going to start to think about who am I serving? So I clearly would argue vehemently that and under the definition of preservation, we are not displacing. Right. And if anyone is thinking about displacing, I would be very disturbed. As a nonprofit and as a partner to the city, I think the city would be disturbed unless you had a plan that they were inappropriately housed and you had a plan to house them in a more appropriate setting, okay? And that could be either people who are in a supportive housing building that need to move out into less supportive, or people who are in a supportive housing building that might actually need more supportive services, right? So it could go either way. And so that's fair, but displacement, absolutely not.
That's a great segue.
Yeah. So typically we're going to require that you offer relocation agreements to allow tenants to come back. So that typically is not an issue. There's also service contracts attached to these projects, so you have a set population that you're serving. Some of the older buildings have some weird categories. I don't even know if I want to mention it because we don't do them anymore, like housing needy and weird stuff like that. So sometimes we will adjust that when they go through year 15. But one other thing to add is the rental assistance piece is that sometimes, depending on the voucher type, whether it's tenant-based or project-based, there's a lot of coordination that has to happen there. Because if someone's out of the unit, we can't continue to pay on it. But sometimes if there's checkerboarding, we can switch it around. So there's just a lot of coordination that has to happen very early on from the beginning of the talks with our Division of Tenant Resources or with another PHA if NYCHA is giving vouchers or things like that. You have to do a lot of that coordination from the beginning because it can easily get tricky.
Kerry, is there anything you want to add?
I think just kind of thinking about preservation sort of in general, our goal is to always keep, who is in place and really value that affordability of in-place residents. So whether the project was previously regulated at, let's say, like 80% AMI, if you've got tiers in there of folks who are at lower AMIs, 30%, 40%, we're going to ask to lock those in and may trade off for, upon vacancy, potentially a higher tier, depending on what kind of financing that we're leveraging. So our goal is always to, as Ismene said, and we're aligned here, is to keep folks in place, but really look at the projects as having these opportunities to give us deeper affordability if they are regulated than maybe what had been previously regulated, or if they're unregulated, looking at an opportunity to lock in those lower rents. That is absolutely a policy goal for the city and what we look for in our preservation stock when preservation programs projects are coming in.
Great. So,
Michael, if I could just add, it's not so much, the issue is really not so much displacement. I don't think anybody in our industry is interested in displacement or really undertaking displacement. The issue is more around relocation and temporary relocation. And that goes back to Kerry's point at the very beginning, which is undertaking a physical needs assessment of the building. Depending on what the building needs will determine, what happens in the unit, and if it's a full gut renovation or substantial renovation of that unit, or whether it's just a moderate or light rehab, whether you can temporarily move people out. In a lot of cases, we've undertaken preservation projects, renovation projects where people need to be out during the day. So between 9 to 5, the workers, the labourers are in the unit between 9 to 5, and you make sure that the water's back on at the end of the day. And if that happens over the course of a week, as the windows replaced or kitchen cabinets, countertops, that becomes, and that ties into the checkerboarding and how you coordinate and how make that happen. And again, it all kind of becomes a little bit iterative and circular because it ties into how much capital is available, how much resources, what you can leverage, what you can actually do from a physical perspective, what you would like to do from a physical perspective in the building, and what you can afford from a financial perspective. And then that circles back to what happens in the unit and how you plan for that relocation, whether it's moving somebody off site for a period of time or whether it's checkerboarding and you want people out on a particular line just from 9 to 5 during the day, that the water's back on at the end of the day. So it's a very complex undertaking. Yeah. Needs a lot of coordination from management down to the management company, down to in most cases we have a relocation person on board, to the contractor, to the architect, to the owner's rep. A full team and coordination and communication between the team becomes key, and that in itself circles back to the capacity issue of the organization.
Yeah, I just want to say, that what Niall just said, the team, right? So we've been focusing. I don't know exactly who's in the room, but I always think about the developer has to care, has to be driven. We're working with the city as a partner, whether you have a consultant like Niall who cares, but your whole team has to care. Like, has your architect ever done a rehab project? Has your architect ever talked to tenants? Okay, has your contractor ever done a rehab project? Has your contractor ever talked to tenants? Okay, there are people who should not do this work. Okay, and so you should think about that. Okay, and so we're talking about whether we should do this work or not, right? On developer level. But I think that you want to be asking yourself when you're putting your team together, am I putting the right team together to be successful? I think that's really critical. And I just want to say, to Sarah's point, this whole issue of the money and the subsidies, I will tell you, the day you move the person out of the room, out of their apartment temporarily, you will get the notice that that Section 8's coming in for an HQS inspection. And you're thinking, that apartment has no kitchen cabinets, okay? And so this whole thing around being in the conversation, and it is not easy because we don't, and even HPD can't control. Some of this stuff is statutory, and you're like between a rock and a hard place on this stuff. Yeah, and so exactly. So I want to say it's actually a dilemma, and you will get caught. You will fail HQS. There's all of this. You have to kind of have an appetite for failing things, and then just getting up and fixing it and getting back at it.
That's any other comments?
Just one thing to add to the team: the social service staff is part of that team, and as it plays a big part in the relocation process.
Are you guys taking notes, by the way? Okay.
And also, I didn't mention that coordinating with where you have your service contracts. So you have to hit a certain vacancy rate to keep your contract. So just making sure you're coordinating with them about holding vacancies and things like that when you're doing either checkerboarding or moving people out. HPD, even now more than ever, I think is in a lot of constant contact with HRA. So there's a lot of communication. So it's better for you to reach out to them than them finding out from us that you're going to be holding units and everything.
Oh, that's great. Thank you so much, guys. This was really good start of the conversation. So now that you've been in the position, we say, you know what? I think we want to pursue this project. We think it's something that we want to take on. We got to think about the financial needs of the buildings. We've done the assessment, right? So a few questions there for the group, and we'll, you guys can sort of take this. We can have an engaged conversation. So how do issues with operating the building affect the building in the long term? So what are the most common issues you've seen, and what steps can a building owner take now to increase the right size cash flow of an older building? Now, is RAD, rental assistance demonstration, an option here in this case? See about that? So we'll start with that question. That's a lot to digest right now. So we'll start with that, and then we'll go through some other things.
I think I can just start on the operations side, just on a very basic level, right? When we see projects coming in, and this is absolutely something that owners should look at before coming into the preservation pipeline, what are operations, right? How is your M&O? Is your M&O high in certain places? Is it because your systems are out of date, or you've had ongoing maintenance and repair needs? Or is potentially your property management, does it need a second look? Do you need to bring in a different property manager? Is this the right relationship? Because that can absolutely impact then if you're not kind of tightening that up before coming into the preservation pipeline. Are you really able to leverage as much debt as you could, or do you really want to have to deal with HPD about why your water bills are so high? So having those conversations internally before approaching the city, I think helps people understand sort of where they need to make improvements. Then we also see projects that are kind of start to spiral, right? They have high operating costs. They have low rents, so your legal rents are low. Property managers or owners haven't taken those rental increases. And then also you're potentially getting violations. The tenants aren't happy. You're falling into arrears, and then you have municipal arrears in this sort of quick operational spiral. So I think we're absolutely encouraging owners before they're thinking about coming in to talk to the city, really looking at where those operational improvements need and can be assisted prior to getting a rehab loan or tax exemption. Some things can't be fixed until you start lowering your property taxes or bringing in a lot of capital to be able to change out the systems, improve the boilers. But thinking about what's impacting and what's controllable now as you're thinking about a financing, I think is a good sort of starting place for any building owner.
Okay. So I call these current opportunities. I almost called them current mistakes, but I wanted to be positive. So I'm going to go through some concrete items that you can do now, either if you're just opening a building or you're 15 years in, that I constantly see with the rental assistance attached to the units, because there's money available and we're willing to give it away, but people aren't claiming it. So I'm going to break it up a little bit. So first I want to start out, often projects will have, developer, a management team, a social service staff, and sometimes an intake staff. Sometimes those are all the same people. Sometimes there are 3 different groups or 4 different groups. Either way, I find sometimes a disconnect between all of them, which make it hard to be successful in terms of getting all the operating funding that you need. And I'll kind of like weave that in throughout this conversation. So I often try and, when I'm having conversations with the people who are submitting applications to me, I say, please have the building management staff on, have the social service staff, because everyone plays a part in getting pieces usually to the applications for tenants, and it can delay the process. So the one thing I see constantly is people don't request rent increases from us. So this is across the board. All of our rental subsidies, which we do contracts for continuum of care for both shelter plus care and SRO mod. Most of these older preservation projects will be SRO mod. We also do housing choice vouchers, which is we have 45 projects, older projects, and it's around 2,500 units that have housing choice vouchers from us because there wasn't other rental subsidies at that time. We also do project-based vouchers since about 2008, and now we have 1515. So all of those have a little bit different way of determining what the rent for a unit will be, but for all of those projects, we have a basic standard process of submitting the lease to us with the new rent 60 days prior to that expiring. This, and Kerry can kind of talk to it, this often doesn't happen. So when it finally gets to year 15, the rents are at still $800 and the legal rents are that also. So there's 2 parts. You have to be increasing your legal rents annually in order to get a higher rent, which you should be requesting annually. If anyone wants to talk about specific projects after the fact, we can kind of go through that. I have some in mind that could do this. Because you want to put yourself in a better place when you get to year 15. Because in order to increase the legal rents, if they're so low, you have to do a rent restructuring, which requires a loan, and it puts you in a different position that's a little trickier when you're getting to preservation. In terms of specifically housing choice vouchers, because a lot of these older programs do have housing choice vouchers. We don't give them for new projects anymore. We have contracts that we do. But these are tenant-based, so they work differently and can take up to like 6 months from when an application is submitted to me before you even start getting payment. So you're having 6 months. You're not going to get retro pay. So I took over this job about a year or so ago, and quarterly, we basically reach out to whoever our contact person is at the agency and say, do you need vouchers for your unit? I usually have to follow up 2-3 times to get a response for them in order to request the vouchers from our Division of Tenant Resources, because we're not just given an HCV. We have to we have an allocation, we have to make sure we have enough money available, so I have to get feedback from the sponsors. And then applications need to be submitted within 30 days. That is across the board for all of our rental subsidies. So when they're delayed, sometimes I can't even accept them, or it's affecting, obviously, the operating funding you're going to be getting. For housing choice vouchers, for those projects that have them, since December 2018, HPD instituted an exception payment standard. So for anyone that has a tenant-based voucher through HPD, they can utilize that voucher wherever. They've always been able to do that, but it used to be a set standard for the bedroom size, and now we have an exception payment standard that's based on zip code. So that works for your buildings too. Based on your zip code, you could be asking for more money. If you haven't increased your legal rent, you can't ask for more money, but it's something that I'm trying to get those that are submitting the applications into me to start doing that. In terms of continuum of care, these are projects, and we have, I think it's around 45 or so grants. We have a unit that oversees those grants. Often we're underspending those contracts because either applications aren't being submitted to us in time, or we are approving a general rent increase for the whole contract, but then the intake staff or building management is not actually putting that increase on the lease, so we're not giving them the extra money. And then that causes the project to underspend on those grants. When you underspend, both internally the COC in New York City, as well as HUD does evaluations, and they can cut the grant, or we will return money if it's not spending. So there's money available, and it's just really connecting those staff members, that working organization that are helping with the reporting and all of that for the COC grants, and the actual building management or intake staff that are submitting the applications to us and making sure they're requesting the correct rent. And timeliness of application submission. Again, these contracts, you have to utilize the money in order to keep the contract. So applications sometimes are submitted to us 6 months late, 8 months late, and we can't always pay back if the contract is ended, and then you're also just not spending the funds. And then project-based vouchers. So I said since about 2008 we've been doing those vouchers. But again, we constantly see rent increases not being requested, as well as the legal rents not being requested. But also because project-based vouchers is unique in terms of our rental assistance, and applicants cannot move in before they're approved by HPD. So unfortunately, it is a longer process, and that's a HUD regulation, not a HPD regulation. So what is often happening is we're getting an application, not always that quickly, so that can be sped up, but the building management is not requesting inspections for the unit. So we can't move forward with briefing a tenant, which is required, and then sending out approval for the tenant until that inspection takes place. So what I always tell the intake staff, whoever's submitting the application to me, is I try to tell them, speak with your management staff and confirm there's an inspection that has happened. That continuously adds delays to the process, and obviously I get calls from HRA asking me why isn't this tenant moved in, and it's just because an inspection hasn't taken place because it hasn't been requested. So these are really simple items that you can be doing now from day one, but also puts you in a much better position once you actually get to your preservation unit to actually have more cash flow in the project and have reserves that you can use for developing the rest of the building.
Do you think, again, is RAD considered an option?
Yes. So I'll start off.
And then we can go to Ismene and to Niall.
Okay.
Everyone knows what RAD, Rental Assistance Demonstration Project Section. Okay,
so
great.
that's when everyone may not, because we have so many projects that are eligible, but they haven't come to us yet. So as part of that, RAD is when projects who have SRO mod or mod rehab can switch to a project-based voucher contract. So we are getting a bigger pipeline now. I know HUD actually started reaching out to some groups too. And then HPD is actually going to have an informational session, I believe, in September or August. So we'll invite groups to it because it's a really great opportunity to get rid of those SRO contracts that increase by OCAF and are at $900 a rent. They don't give enough to support the projects. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about timing, and then Kerry will talk about how that looks like when you're getting additional funding. So just in terms of timing, it is a process. So typically, you're going to want to communicate with our Division of Tenant Resources at HPD at least a year, I would say 1.5 years to advance of wanting to actually end that contract for the SRO mod or mod rehab and turn it into a project-based voucher contract, because they have to do certain tenant meetings. There's also an application to HUD, and it just really is a lengthy process that you want to get started and meet with them as soon as possible. And then it's a tricky situation because you are doing this and coming to year 15 because you need to rehab the units, and this is kind of talking about the checkerboarding. But in order to get those units, specifically for RAD, on the contract, they actually have to be occupied units. So it's looking at whether you can give up some of those units because you're going to get higher rent and have those for checkerboarding and not have them on the contract, or whether you actually need all those units on the contract to have a good cash flow. So it's thinking about that early on so it doesn't become much of an issue later on.
So kind of thinking about the overlap of RAD opportunities in the year 15 pipeline, I think I know we closed our first RAD conversion with a tax credit deal last year, and the year 15 sort of exit moment, so reaching the end of your tax credit compliance period, your investor wants to exit, you're doing your assessment of your physical needs, is a good opportunity to then look, especially when we have the SRO and SRO mod contracts that are starting to be a larger part of the tax credit portfolio. This is a good moment to sort of do all these things at once. So you're able to, and as part of that, we're able to use our regular preservation tools that we would use on any project, which I'll talk to in a second, but thinking about where that RAD component kind of assists in operations and is a jumping off point for entering into a long-term regulatory agreement where you've got, where you're set up for longer term viability. Sara mentioned, having projects with very low legal rents. So one of the preservation tools that we have is being able to reset, and we call it rent restructuring, but reset the legal rents. So we're going in, we're doing a tenant notification process, we're assessing what the proper level of rent setting should be, and for a project with a project-based contract, or that's converting to a project-based contract, we're going to want to maximize that project-based contract. So being able to reset those rents is something that I think for any project can be a necessity. It's something that we take very seriously and we don't like to do, right? Especially if tenants don't have subsidy. It actually can cause a rent increase. We never rent burden a tenant. We're always maxing out any expected rent at 30% of their income. But especially for projects that are largely subsidy, you're going to want to make sure that you've got those, you're maximizing the subsidy, and rent restructuring is the ability to do that. So in this project that we closed last year, we had to restructure the rents. There were also significant capital needs. So we had to provide a source of financing for that because the project was not able to leverage any debt because of the low rents. We also had existing HPD debt that was coming due, kind of mid-regulatory agreement of about $3 million. So, entering into a new long-term regulatory agreement with a $3 million balloon in a couple years is not the best setup for a long-term viability. So we're able to, when projects come into our pipeline, take the existing debt, that HPD debt, and be able to extend it. So we're able to make it coterminous with any new regulatory term that's coming into place. And then thinking about what kind of tax exemption we should be layering in. So for the most part, in the tax credit world, we're doing a 420C, but we also have the ability to do an Article 11, sort of depending on the project, depending on the ownership type. So for the interesting and definitely learning challenge in doing a RAD conversion with HPD, bringing in new HPD debt, also rent restructuring, you're sort of battling with a couple different timelines. You're dealing with and managing those timelines, and I think where there's potential is to bring in a consultant, kind of thinking about that team question, is can your organization take all of these things on, going through the RAD conversion, working with HPD on due diligence, working to get a new loan, and also managing multiple tenant notification timelines and processes. So you've got your DTR RAD notification process, then you have your HPD, if you're restructuring rent, our tenant notification process. So it's a lot to wrap your arms around. It's a lot for us to wrap our arms around. But that kind of speaks to having the right team and understanding kind of the organizational abilities. So working backwards from also managing the timeline for your rental or your construction completion, your rental increases, and then when the PBV contracts are coming up to renewal, so you're able to get those higher rents at the point that you're resetting the rents, all takes really careful coordination. So again, all of these tools are sort of available to any preservation project, but where you're bringing in sort of a RAD conversion component, you really have to be mindful of that coordination with HPD, with DTR, because you're working with multiple units within one organization.
So as a moderator, I'm going to do a moderator privilege here. There's a lot of information that flowed pretty quickly. Any particular questions that you might have within the context of these particular responses around the challenges, RAD, and others?
Michael, I have a question.
Yeah. Well, no, I want to give them privilege first. I'm going to give them the privilege, and then I'll give it to you. And then you got the stage later. Yeah.
So specifically to do rent resetting, the city has to provide a loan. So you would want to think about, is there, and be able to express, like through some sort of physical needs assessment, that there is in fact sort of a new need in the building. There is a new need to reset rents. So we are limited in our ability to rent restructure when we're not providing a source of financing. In terms of amending a regulatory agreement, what is this new action? We always have to be sort of doing a new action. Entering into a new extended regulatory term, providing a new tax exemption, being able to provide or needing to provide new capital. There has to be sort of a moment of need that has us respond, that we're able to then provide some additional assistance, but it will be in exchange for something like additional affordability, deeper affordability, permanent affordability. We have many policy needs that the city is juggling, and those are things that we apply when folks are coming to us for sort of additional assistance.
And it's not, in addition to Year 15, our supportive housing loan program does do some rehab properties. So, but that's kind of decided internally when a project comes to us. We kind of say, where does this best fit? If it's not year 15, if it's not one of their programs, then we can also use a supportive housing loan program to do some of those.
Great. Any other question? Okay. All right. So yeah, you have a question, right?
I have a question. I have a comment and a question. So one is on the project-based Section 8.
Mm-hmm.
One, again, a lot has to do with what does the building need, right? Because that's going to dictate how much money you need to borrow, et cetera. So, but in buildings that don't need a lot, I was laughing because the underutilization of various programs. And so I didn't realize HPD had this this running project-based Section 8 RFP, right? And one year we just put all of our we submitted all of our projects in for project-based Section 8 and 11 projects or something, and 9 came back. We won, and I'm like, I don't think anyone else applied because
Can I jump in here?
Yeah.
I just want to say it's a very limited source.
Right,
or PPV.
I know.
I suggest not submitting them.
I know, but I did get 9 projects. That's why I said nobody else applied that year. Yeah. So I'm just saying that what's interesting about that is if you don't need a lot, and you've been taking your rent increases, and you have people, individual, very low-income people, where they're struggling. So if you know your people in your building, and you know that they're rent burdened, and you know that HPD and your M&O's struggling, and you know that HPD has this limited resource, so you don't just apply blindly. You could go in and you don't need to do rehab. You don't need to do anything. It's actually just a way to increase your cash flow and house, without rent burden, a small number of very low-income people. And so for us, it was a very particular way that we applied that program,
right,
because it was a way to do it without rehab. It was just a way to help rent burden and bring some cash flow into a project.
So
Sara.
our asset management team also sometimes gives housing choice vouchers for rent burden tenants. That's one of our categories that we can do. So that's also something you should speak with your asset management team at HPD with, because that's also an option, an easier kind of way to do it.
Ismene, just let you comment before going to Niall's, but Ismene, you can get points.
My question was around combination.
Yeah.
So I wanted to know, of all of these various programs, some I know you can't combine with others, but one solution might be a combo. Is how many of them are combinable, and how many of them you don't want us to?
Rental subsidies,
Mm-hmm.
or
yeah.
So when you say combinable, you mean how many can you have at one building?
Yeah.
Oh. So typically,
given your appetite for multiple reporting requirements, like Kerry responded, but
right. So it can vary. Most of the projects that are coming through supportive housing into preservation have a rental subsidy, so it's easier on everyone, HPD and building staff, to not have multiple contracts for the building because they often then have different requirements. So it's not a great idea to do both. We do some new construction projects, and so it would apply to preservation where you do a set number at maybe 8 PBV or things like that. But it is really looking at, is that necessary, especially in preservation, if you can increase the rents on the units that you have just by requesting rent increases or increasing legal rent. We'd rather do that than throw another rental subsidy on, because it just gets complicated in that process.
So now I'm going to shift it to you, sort of as a development consultant. How can you be supportive to these nonprofit organizations that aren't experienced, and then get into some of the weeds there?
Because I think the original question was around operating funds and how do you get operating. I think the answer is pretty simple. You see how complex it is, and you just go in and you sit down with HPD. That's the very first step, because they know more about this stuff than most people in the community. And don't go to HPD from the perspective of fear that this is a government regulatory agency. They're there to help solve the problem, and so Kerry and Sara and the team there are very creative, and so I think the dialogue starts with having a meeting and describing generally the issue even before you can get to the third-party reports and physical needs assessments about, this is the population we serve, this is the issues that we face, what are the possible options for us? And from there, you can start to kind of build your team. And again, we'll talk a little bit about the jigsaw and what it takes to put this together, but that's kind of the very first step.
Yeah, and so the advice that you give, sort of,
Go meet with HPD.
Yeah, just go to HPD. Okay, that's the answer, guys. Go to HPD.
I mean, we do a lot of just like intro meetings. Like there is like, hey, here's this project. Here's the team we're thinking about. You know, maybe we're a year off from development, and sitting down and kind of thinking through like what are the programs that would be applicable. What's existing in the building? What are the things that need to be tweaked? What's immovable? And just talking through. It is a lot of problem solving.
Yeah.
That's what actually makes it really interesting. We're pretty nimble for a city agency, and can help work through that problem solving. And you might not walk out of there with some perfect package of financing and regulatory structure, but you will have guidance. And I think that guidance helps start chipping down. Like, where does this go? Where do we go from here? What are the timelines? Is this going to be tomorrow? No. Is it going to be 3 years from now? Probably something shorter than that. But really understanding what the city's timelines are, what your own timelines are, and maybe you have to get your board on board. What are those internal agreements that need to happen? Where are there inflexibilities? Where are there concerns? Because you can find divergent factors there. So all of these things, we're always happy to sort of just do an intro meeting. Meet us, talk about the team, and talk about what the project is.
The one question I would have maybe for the city is, I mean, we talk about these programs in the context of real estate and operating expenses and utility costs, insurance costs, and so forth. But this sector of the industry also focuses on services. Mm-hmm. And so, most of us in the real estate business focus on the real estate, but what's different about the supportive housing community is it's very much service driven. And so, within the context of, I'll just ask Kerry and Sara, within the context of supportive housing preservation, how do you see the service component kind of fitting into this? What are the funding streams that fund like services? How does that piece work?
Sure. So it's a tricky question, and we're actively working with other city agencies and MHANY on kind of thinking this through for some of our older buildings. Some of the older funding, like from DHS for service funding, may not be enough to support necessarily the needs in the building or the type of clients you're getting. So we've kind of been working through that. They don't do new service funding in terms of giving additional funds in that way, but there is 1515, which is our new rental subsidy. It is for new units, though. So we have had some preservation projects approach us about that, but it has to be new units to the portfolio. So that becomes a little tricky, but we are thinking through that currently with some of our preservation projects. If there are vacant units that are held and rehabbed, can those be new units to the portfolio? But then if you want to talk about the reserves,
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the approaches, preservation, our goal, our expertise is not necessarily supportive housing. The bulk of what we're doing is not supportive. So we take a do no harm approach, but also coordinate really closely with our colleagues in supportive to be able to give guidance on the contracts. If there is a need there, we try to be flexible, right? Are there additional reserves in the project? Should we be parlaying those into some, some use? Should we be prioritizing cash flow because that needs to be, paying some type of services that are in the building for which you don't have a contract for? So we're trying to help problem solve around those things within the parameters of saving city subsidy and making sure that the project is getting the work that it's needing, and really relying on the expertise of our internal teams, but also of the owner to know, like, these things have to stay put. These are the needs right now. These are the things I have to solve for. And then we're able to back into on the financing side. And be sensitive to what is in place and not sort of rewrite a regulatory agreement that's going to make you completely ineligible for the funding subsidy that you have and the operating subsidy that's coming into place.
Right.
I think when I asked the question about combining, it was kind of to that end. So if we're taking existing, we're looking at an existing project now, and the idea of, and what I mentioned earlier, that the city is in crisis, right, in terms of like the homeless crisis and a supportive housing, housing a supportive housing population, and then the costs related to that. So the idea of when you're looking at your own building or purchasing any which way, are there vacancies? Is there a way to carve out a set of of apartments that could be 15-15, could meet a city need. You know, will add a little complexity to your reporting requirements, but it actually is just a complete win-win-win. And I would say by putting together a really good development team, it doesn't have to sound as onerous or as, you know, both, you know, development team, and if you have the right, looking inwards, management and operational team to handle that, then I think we can be partners with a city bigger than HPD, like, you know, in terms of serving a very, you know, kind of meeting the needs of the city. And I would challenge us to do that.
The one thing I would add, so the 15-15 is a 1-15 ratio, basically, is what we expect for the project. So you also have to think of scale. If you have 5 units, that's probably not best for a 15-15 contract, even if they're going to be new to the portfolio. And then also the switch in services. So some of the older projects that have the DHS service funding, that's a specific, you know, that's our homeless population. They're not necessarily chronically homeless with severe mental illness, like some of our New York 3 contracts or the 15-15 contracts. So you need to be able to, if you're going to take on those new units, you have to have the correct services that are going to be, some may say they actually aren't different than the population you're serving, so I understand the populations sometimes are the same, but sometimes they're not. So it's just about making sure if you're going to have, the 15-15 does require a lot of evidence-based practices and things like that that aren't always required and existing in the current service contracts if you're going to keep them, yeah. Great. But come talk to us. Actually, come talk to DOHMH and HRA. But HPD is usually involved in those conversations too. So
great. Kerry, anything? So you mentioned it was able to sort of take you through a particular project. Would you like to walk us through maybe
Sure.
one example so the folks can see it? So we get to the pretty pictures now.
All right, so I'm going to talk about, this is a project called Capitol Hall that some people may be familiar with. It's on the Upper West Side and 78th Street. And it was a typical SRO, 202 bed SRO, former hotel that was converted to an SRO, like a lot of buildings on the Upper West Side. Typical SRO, small 10 by 10 units, gang showers, baths. And that's owned and operated by Goddard Riverside. And so the idea was the building was functionally obsolete and needed significant repair and investment. And in an ideal world, Goddard wanted to convert the SRO units into small efficiency units where each of the tenants would have their own bathroom, which, in a confined space is already challenging to undertake as a concept. So when I talked earlier about, preservation, undertaking a preservation project, it's really a big jigsaw puzzle that involves many pieces. And kind of, a successful preservation project really understands what the different jigsaw puzzle pieces are and where they fit and where in the process they fit. It starts with a conversation with HPD. It starts with an assessment of the building from an operations perspective, from a physical perspective, from a residence perspective, from a rent roll perspective. All of those kind of factors kind of come together at the initial stages. And beyond that, it really, a successful preservation development will involve putting together a sophisticated, capable team that's going to undertake the project and undertake it in a holistic manner so that communication and coordination become a real key. And so things like hiring, Ismene mentioned hiring the right architect. And I think collectively we've probably made enough mistakes that we know at this point what not to do. These are our collective, mistakes over 20 plus years in the industry. But hiring an architect, if you have an architect who, most architects like to design shiny new buildings, but those types of architects are not necessarily a good fit for what you're trying to do in this particular case, which was utilize the existing space that you had and come up with a design that's as efficient as possible in terms of the use of that space. So, hiring a competent architect engineering team, hiring a general contractor, I think is a real key. As Ismene mentioned it, somebody who works with tenants, has worked with tenants in place, has worked with relocating tenants and communicating tenants, has worked with management companies and relocation specialists in terms of coordinating how that works and when that works is a key component. For a lot of sponsors and not-for-profits, it's bringing the board along. Keeping your executive management team and your board informed as to this is the process. This is what the outlay of pre-development dollars is going to look like. I mean, you can go to organizations like CSH and the Acquisition Fund and get some assistance with pre-development dollars, but laying out $600,000-700,000 is not unusual in terms of undertaking a preservation project. And so informing your board as to what this process looks like, what the risk is for the organization, what guarantees you're going to have to provide. Communication becomes the key there. Physical needs assessment, Kerry talked about it, trying to get an understanding of the operations of the building at the outset, as well as getting an understanding of the physical needs from the outset become a real key. And it becomes a key in terms of the useful life of each of the major building systems, but also what you would like to do. And in this particular case, this was much more than just determining what the building systems were. This was a holistic undertaking and a real kind of redesign of an existing building. But the team and the jigsaw puzzle become the key. And what we did in this particular case with Goddard Riverside was to put together a financing plan, working together. We helped Goddard Riverside to put together the team. We went down, we sat down with HTC and HPD. We kind of mapped out the plan. I mean, we hired an architect that was able to design the building to essentially come up where 70% of the units could be small efficiency units, and the balance would essentially be designed in 3-unit pods. So the 3 units would share one bathroom, but each would have a lockable door. And so that was a fairly significant win for this building on the Upper West Side. But it was a hugely complex undertaking, and it ended up with us emptying and coming up with a relocation plan to temporarily, and by temporary I mean a year, relocate people off-site so that we could empty 1/3 of the building, demolish and renovate 1/3 of the building, and then checkerboard it by taking the second third, moving those people into their finished units, starting the second phase, and likewise with the third phase. So a much more complex undertaking, preservation undertaking, than I think we've ever done before. But at the end of the day, it resulted in maintaining 202 units, which is of primary importance, given the lack of, not just in this location, but throughout the city, the lack of supportive housing. We did this at a point in time when RAD was brand new, and so we chose not to undertake RAD because it was already a complex undertaking. We did not want to add to the complexity by kind of layering in a HUD process that we just didn't know what that was going to undertake. And so we were able to do this kind of with the existing project-based contracts that were in place, working with the city to develop a kind of a financial plan. And so that process of forming the development team, and it's a very much an iterative process. You form the development team, you have a general kind of vision for what you want to do, and there are a lot of kind of decisions and options that you make along the way in terms of, we want to do this, but it costs Y. We want to do X, costs Y. And so you have to make some decisions. There's not an endless pot of money. And that's where the dialogue and the discussion with HPD and the city is really important. What can we do on real estate taxes? Article 11420C are some options. What can we do on the revenue side? In this particular case, we had project-based vouchers that weren't at fair market rents, that were at the existing levels. So this process is an iterative process that takes, in this case, this took, 18 months because they kind of started out with the wrong architectural firm. But it certainly is a 12 to 18 month process to get to the finish line for something as complicated as this. I would say kind of 9 to 12 months is a not untypical time frame to get a preservation deal to financial closing. The other thing that's different now is that this was done with tax-exempt bonds and tax credits. So we had 4% tax credits in bonds from HCC. The city's position and policy at this point is not to use that resource for preservation deals. It's maybe a little bit easier without that complexity. But that's a fairly significant resource in terms of the equity from the sale of tax credits that has to be made up in other ways. So it's this complex, iterative undertaking. Having an understanding of the pieces of the puzzle, how they fit in together, where they fit in the process, becomes a key, and that's really where people like Ismene and myself can be really helpful to organizations.
Just a question for the audience to some extent. How many people have anyone been involved in the preservation project? A lot of hands. Does this all sound similar in terms of the challenges that you're facing? I think one thing that I think was quite interesting, again, buy-in for the board. The board likes pretty buildings. They like new construction. They like to see, and I think, Ismene, maybe throwing to you, the question is, how does that dialogue happen? Because particularly this is gritty. It takes a lot of work. It involves people. What are the strategies that you've used really to sort of be able to get in that position where this makes sense for the board and for the organization?
Well, MHANY's board actually is a mutual housing association, so maybe someone else wants to answer the question. So my board members live in MHANY buildings, so they're used to gritty. So they have grown up and aged in rehabbed and renovated, preserved buildings. But they really get it, and they actually if anyone in the room is having trouble, you can ask my board members to come and help sell the idea, because they will sell it for you. So they're very familiar with the challenges, but they totally we have taken on projects because the board has said we have to take this on. So I would say MHANY may be a little bit unique in that case. And so if you want board members, I will offer them up.
For those that have a board that may have a different structure, maybe folks in the private sector, any particular reaction or advice from that perspective? Yes. Yeah. Any other points? Yes.
This is sort of a related question, but are some of these buildings actually have historic have landmark status?
So we have a building. We have actually a couple buildings where they did have landmark status, and one on the outside and one in the lobby. And so again, that just becomes. It just gets added to the layer of complication. So we had to go in, and we had to, and actually it was difficult because the building was in very bad condition, and the historical people, the SHPO, wanted us to preserve it, but we couldn't preserve it because that stuff isn't available anymore. But we worked again, right architect. We went really deep, and we found kind of alternative materials that actually ended up matching the existing, and were able to meet the requirements. So some of these buildings will have historical significance, and that's going to add complication. It's going to add kind of real creativity and cost.
So this is the.
We had to tile. We had to find the floor tiles. We had to find floor tiles to match the existing floor tiles.
Go ahead, Niall, and then I'll have a question.
So, I mean, this particular building was not historical, even though it looks historical, so it wasn't a landmark. But there's, we've also worked with, historic buildings in New York City, outside New York City, and yes, there's, it's a lot more complex. It involves yet another agency that has another kind of, say in what happens in the building. But from a funding perspective, there's also an opportunity. There's historic tax credits, both federal and New York State historic tax credits, which can be become another possible revenue source or capital source.
Elizabeth?
I was going to say to your earlier board management, from the for-profit developer partner side, having run into some issues where a board completely changes over from a non-profit partner, various questions all about this, that it's important, I would suggest, in construction, when this happens, and I'm sure it's rare, but that we get board sign-off, like, down to every member even if necessary, so that there's some institutional memory, even if it's just in legal form, because the memory has disappeared. So I just offer that up kind of before it's successfully avoiding some.
I mean, there's in addition to that, I mean, if it involves a sale of an asset, sometimes, in these situations, if it was a sale to a newly formed limited partnership, you actually need Attorney General approval. And, that's also kind of a not, short process. But in that case, then you have legal authorization from the board that you have to get to submit as part of that. So
I saw some other hands for questions. I'll do that, and then I'll ask a last set of questions for the group. Yes.
I wonder if any one of you and your organizations have had conversations about the Climate Mobilization Act and how that may impact your buildings. That's the carbon emissions law that was just passed recently, which is really a great thing for where we're going with our buildings and the right thing for the environment, but it's going to be quite challenging, I think, from a funding standpoint and also just from the logistics and nitty-gritty. We have to slash emissions, and I know there's a phase-in for buildings such as affordable and supportive. I just wondered if anyone could speak to some questions that they may have related to that law, if they think that it's not going to affect their buildings.
So I know that as people were advocating for this law, and I can't imagine anyone not being supportive of it, but on a preservation deal is really hard, right? And even just general energy savings in a rehab, on a mod rehab, is much harder than new construction, right? In terms of the exterior envelope, et cetera. And I think that the law makes accommodation for preservation, but I think as preservation developers and owners, we want to participate in that law. And I think that so we've looked at costs. We as that law was going through the negotiation process, whatever, we looked at costs to preservation deals, and kind of how that's going to add, I would say, disruption, I guess, kind of added complication to the rehab process, and is it going to involve relocation or not? If you're adding insulation to the exterior envelope of the building, it's very difficult to do without moving the people out of their apartments. Okay, there's a lot we've learned to do without moving people, but there's some things we have not learned to do yet. And so I think that we're going to see, and maybe a heads up to HPD, that there'll be, as this law kind of comes in, there are going to be additional costs that we're going to have to incorporate into our budgets.
I'm not really familiar with the details of the law, but everything we do involves some level of energy efficiency, green retrofit. One of the things we're working on a project. I think it's closing tomorrow, Kerry, right? That's a retrofit of a passive house. So it's an existing building that's going to be retrofitted to passive house standards, which I don't know if you're familiar with passive house standards, but they're basically the creme de la creme, the highest levels of efficiency you can get. It's the building standard in Germany and a lot of countries in Europe. But it is expensive because the building trades are just not familiar with the construction techniques on passive house, so that adds a level of cost. There's also, so passive house essentially delivers 90% energy consumption savings. And the other part that's not kind of factored in is that the lending agencies really are not there in terms of underwriting to those savings. And so that adds to the cost and the complexity of underwriting. And like a lot of projects around the city, these are questions of choices and options, and it's always a trade-off. There's not an endless pot of money to do everything that you want to do. In our industry, it's the choices. It's construction versus affordability. Or subsidy limits, and so that becomes the art form in terms of trying to come up with a financial architecture for what you ultimately want to achieve. But passive is I think the highest standard. In nearly every building, you're doing simple things like putting in high efficiency boilers, putting in R-rated windows, putting in a new roof that has an R value, things that are MPP, which is a water conservation standard. NYSERDA has a program that assists in that. So there is low hanging fruit that you can get in these buildings that nearly everybody, just as a matter of kind of common sense, it makes sense to do because there's going to be utility savings at the end of the day. So it just becomes a level, to what degree can you achieve these energy efficiencies?
I can't remember how it ended. If there was a full exemption, or if they're going to have more time to adhere to it. But yes, there is. It's. I know. But I think, like Niall said, I think every day some of the green initiatives become more common practice, and so I think having the industry learn how to do it on kind of new construction, other projects, and then the preservation world, comes along, and gets, as the costs come down, et cetera.
Right.
Yeah, there's. Sure, and there's certainly paths to compliance. So I think, as Niall made a good point that although there are, there's the passive house standard. I don't know that actually to meet I don't know to meet the mandate, you actually need to become meet that passive house standard. I think we're finding overall for the projects that we're doing, where we're getting the IPNA, we're getting what those energy efficiency measures are. Just as a matter of course, we're sort of getting projects almost all of the way there sort of anyway. And then there's that tipping point where we're absolutely meeting the mandate. But again, where there are carve-outs and where the city is helping to advocate and work with lenders to be able to recognize those cost savings, I think that is still a big push and something that is a major piece of our work over the next year, to be able to say that these savings are proven, these savings are there. We should be recognizing them, and we should be lending against lower costs because we're paying for it. So that's been a big piece of that too.
I think I saw two more hands. Questions? Yes.
I just wanted to know, where were you able to relocate a third of 202 people?
Yeah, it was quite the challenge. I mean, particularly in the Upper West Side, and so it was a variety of, Goddard has some existing units in its portfolio. They worked with other nonprofits who had vacancies. It was a quilt patchwork of options.
And the private market, you put people into the private market?
We did put people into the private market, yeah. So other tax credit projects, so we... Right. Yeah, so, during the year and a half that it took to put the project together, vacancies occurred, and then we just kept them vacant.
Do we see another hand or question? Okay. So I guess simple question. What does success look like for you? And we'll just go through that sort of round. What does success look like for you?
I mean, it's right there on the screen. It's, when you saw what the building was like in what it became. And success for me was, I think a couple of years ago so this building reopened in 2015. And I was at this conference, and somebody from the city, from the DHS, the lady who headed up the homeless shelter, was talking about a woman that she was working, a woman who lived on the street. She was homeless for 18 years, and she never wanted to be in the homeless shelter. And what the city was trying to do to encourage people. And she said, she made a fictitious name, Mary. She said, Mary, we finally got Mary off the street after 18 years. She got her house, and it was in this building.
Great. Ismene?
Yeah, I think I would just say for me and for MHANY, the end is absolutely worth the work. We had to do we're doing a project in Washington Heights, and we went in to meet with residents who've been waiting 20 years for their building to get renovated, and we were going to move them out. And they did not trust us. You can imagine, 20 years later. And so we said, well, why don't you come? And like, who are you? And what do you do? And how do you take care of people? And I said, well, I don't have exactly the right building nearby, but there's one in Brooklyn that really really speaks to it, and the residents can tell you their story. So we had a field trip, and we took the residents from Washington Heights to Crown Heights. And we had our Crown Heights residents not prepped to tell but to tell their story. And so the residents of Washington Heights met the residents of Crown Heights who had been relocated out, and we had to convince them. That was a previous conversation, and it was amazing. And so it was just like that connection, and then and now they moved out, and we're renovating, and they're going to come back, and it's going to be glorious.
Great.
Well, I don't have that type of story, but from a rental assistance perspective, that you're utilizing your contracts because it's only going to benefit the building and ultimately benefit the tenants because you're able to use those funds to make the building a better place to live in. So.
That's just as good, though. Yes, excellent. You got to clap for that, guys. Come on, the city.
I think, we're on the city side, on my side, we're absolutely supportive and happy to be part of these challenging projects. So where these hard problems come to us and where we're able to sort of step out of the box and say, these are the rules, but these are what we have to do to get this project over the finish line and work with great partners to do that. I think that's absolutely, that story happens again and again each year, and we're happy to be able to be supportive in our role for that. I think the preservation world offers a lot of the opportunities for really good problem solving and really complex issues, but we get new tools, we have new tools, we create policy as we go, and we think about how to apply it, and I think that makes the preservation work really good work and really rewarding work.
So with that, we got 5 minutes for you guys to dash over to the cocktail, but also if you wanted to dash over to talk to these folks. But I want to say thank you so much for hanging out with us and talking about this very complex matter, and have a good rest of your day.